Hey, how are we all? We're in week 10, can you believe it? It's basically the last session that we have on the way in which legal practitioners and legal practices are regulated. And we're going to finish off our exploration of the ethical rules and the practice regulation by looking at the ways in which these rules are enforced, and in particular, what the consequences are if somebody fails to meet the standards that are required of the profession. I think before we actually start, I want to spend a little bit of time with a bit of a history lesson, really. Most of this you have read before. Probably the best explainer for this material comes from Parker and Evans, who in chapter 3 talk about the history of the Inns of Court. So back in the 15th century, the profession was, or barristers basically all lived together, whether they were pupils, whether they were senior barristers, they all lived and worked together. And so they kind of created this self-regulatory set of standards that were designed to ensure that that they could live together coherently and that the actions of one of them couldn't bring the others down. And so this idea of the legal profession as a community that's responsible for ensuring that lawyers play these important twin roles as adversarial advocates on the one hand and responsible lawyers on the other, with this important social function of establishing and maintaining the rule of law. And essentially, Parker and Evans go on in chapter 3 to effectively argue that solicitors ultimately organised themselves into professional associations back in the 18th century in a direct attempt to emulate the success of the English Inns of Court. So they saw how much political influence that the barrister had, in part because they were able to inculcate common standards of professional conduct and ethics to create a true self-regulatory community. And so at the pinnacle of self-regulation in Australia, the professional associations effectively promulgated and enforced standards of professional conduct. They investigated and prosecuted complaints, and they provided disciplinary tribunals that would hear charges that were made against their own. It was members of the legal profession themselves who decided on what qualifications it took to get admitted as a member of the profession. They were the ones who issued practicing certificates, and they also policed complaints. So complaints about trust account rules, or the administration of the fidelity funds or insurance schemes. The legal profession also protected legal monopolies or lawyers' monopolies on legal work. They set the standard fees and they prohibited most forms of competition between lawyers. So, in fact, and we've mentioned this before in passing, until relatively recently, lawyers couldn't participate in any form of advertising or price competition. And the rationale for this degree of self-regulation was built on this historical idea that the legal profession was a self-regulating moral community, that there were a group of people who had this superior knowledge, but also a superior set of professional standards that required and allowed them to essentially manage their own ways of doing business because of this professionalism. Now, times have changed a great deal, but when you think about it, we still ultimately have lawyers, judges who are lawyers, making decisions about the discipline of other lawyers at the highest level. While not all lawmakers, so parliamentarians are lawyers, ultimately it is the law itself is largely a codification with amendments for public benefit around the edges of this historical codified set of standards. Um, and the rules, as you will see, and there'll be a number of shorter videos to follow on what I hope are appropriate themes this week, you will see that the rules and the way that the sanctions apply very much come back to this idea of suitability and professionalism. We'll spend quite a bit of time this week looking at sanctions as well. So, in other words, what is the consequence of failing to meet the standards that the profession requires? Now, a disciplinary proceeding isn't a criminal proceeding, so the theory is then that it can't meter out any kind of punishment. But in reality, even if the rules are in place to protect the community against lawyers who don't meet the standards required of the profession, if the punishment involves suspending one's practicing certificate, one's right to practice, or removing it entirely, striking that practitioner off the roll, whether that's the role of solicitors or barristers or otherwise, then in reality there is a punishment, because a person who is suspended or struck off effectively can't do their job. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about a really key definition: unprofessional conduct and professional misconduct. These are two terms that we've mentioned a couple of times along the way, but understanding the key differences to them will be really key to getting your heads around what's required in this module. So I'll see you in that video.